What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Zach Show, where this time we dive into the bizarre, mind-blowing, and sometimes terrifying world of nuclear history with none other than James Mahaffey. As a nuclear engineer and researcher with over 40 years of experience, Mahaffey has spent decades uncovering the strangest, most secretive, and horrifying moments in nuclear science. And today, he's laying it all out. We start with his own journey, the moment that made him fall in love with nuclear energy. From there, we dive into A.Q. Khan, the man who turned from respected scientist into the world's most infamous nuclear smuggler. Then, we go back to where it all started, the Manhattan Project. The urgency of building the bomb meant safety was often an afterthought. We dig into the tragic stories of scientists like Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin, whose encounters with the Demon Core cost them their lives in some of the most gruesome ways imaginable. Mahaffey breaks down what happens to the human body during acute radiation poisoning and why it's one of the worst ways to go. Of course, no nuclear deep dive is complete without Chernobyl. Was it doomed from the start? Could anything have saved Reactor 4 that night? And what would someone standing on the roof of Reactor 3 have felt in those moments? To end off, we talk UFOs, we get into Mahaffey's perfect explanation of what happened at Roswell, his surprising connection to one of the physicists involved in cold fusion, and whether a nuclear-powered Iron Man suit is actually feasible. This is nuclear history like you've probably never heard it before. Without further ado, let's get into it. Jim Mahaffey, thank you for joining me on the Zach Show.
Glad to be here.
So you've spent decades uncovering everything from bizarre nuclear mishaps to full-blown catastrophes. What was the moment that made you fall in love with nuclear energy and its history?
Well, I grew up in the 1950s, and in the 50s, the entire world was digesting World War II. World War II was a big thing, and it caused two big technical subjects to come about, nuclear power and digital computers. Without World War II, there would have been no reason particularly to look at those two subjects, and both were developed on a uh, a fast basis. You know, they had to do it quick, and the invention and eventual production of the atomic bomb was incredible. That they were able to do it in so few years. They did the whole thing in 3 years. Digital computers were secondary. They didn't quite make it through the war, but afterwards it started to gain importance. In 1951, when I was born, there probably were 7, maybe 6 computers in the world, but it just like nuclear power, it caught the imagination of the people and the governments, and it came to be. Um, Computers, I grew up with computers, I grew up with nuclear physics, and I became interested in nuclear physics because it was in everything in the 1950s. I mean, it was on television. Walt Disney had programs about the atomic bomb and nuclear power and all of that. The Atomic Energy Commission was pushing nuclear power to the general population in many ways. For example, they had a program where there would be a experimental nuclear facility in every state of the union, and that included
Really?
yes, everybody had one, at least one. In fact, they put one in Puerto Rico.
Wow.
And
And what year was this?
this is like 1957, I think. Oh,
It's hard to imagine a plan that widespread for the adoption of nuclear energy
it was.
not that long ago with how, you know, tight it makes people's, assholes, for lack of a better word, now when people talk about nuclear energy and
Right.
the incidents and the fatalities, and we'll get into all that stuff. But that's fascinating that not that long ago there was a plan to have an experimental nuclear facility in 50 states.
And it was on television. It was in comedies. It was in serious programming. Uh, there was the uranium rush in the mid 1950s, where the Atomic Energy Commission decided we've got to have some uranium. We can't depend on the Congo and Canada for all of our uranium. We're going to need a lot of it just for the nuclear submarine program. So they had a program where they would pay you big money if you discovered some uranium somewhere. So everybody had to have a Geiger counter all of a sudden. And it became a big topic back in the 50s. A lot of people have forgotten it, but it existed. It was in magazines, it was in movies, it was everywhere. And
Where would people go? Like, where was the Wild West of uranium?
same place gold was basically out in the desert, uh, New Mexico, California, Colorado, Utah, and so on. I think the biggest strike was in Utah. One mine,
Mm,
as it turns out, could supply the government, the Defense Department, with all the uranium they would need for the next 50 years. But now we get our uranium from Australia, from Canada. There are a couple of mines, I think, still in Georgia, in the United States, but there's no particular lack of uranium anymore.
yeah, yeah, and to go back to that time, being born in 1951, growing up in the late 50s, early 60s, you are obviously in the aftermath of the atomic bomb drops, which you mentioned. You're on the front end slash coming to the pulp of the Cold War. So there's that added tension.
Right.
What did it feel like being in school, talking to friends around that time? Do you remember an extra layer of anxiety growing up during that era? Whether do you feel any emotions of just a heightened level of awareness of disaster when you look back at that time, or potential disaster?
Yes, there was. Maybe not as much as it should have been, but there was a lot of, this could happen any day now, and people were digging holes in the ground for shelter. And there was the civil defense agency, and you had civil defense signs all over everything, meaning "Come here if there's a nuclear bomb coming." And they were outfitted with radiation detection equipment. You had Geiger counters and little things that fit on your pocket and could record radiation. We had, you know, a lot of dehydrated food being developed at that time, so you could
Yeah,
have.
yeah, moon food.
Yes, yes, you could just
That
store food.
that t- that those tasty packets of frozen sand, or whatever was inside those.
Exactly. My father wanted to dig out the basement and make a shop where we could build things. And as a result, there's a lot of dirt appearing on the property in the front yard, made a big mound of dirt. People thought we were digging a civil defense shelter for atomic bombs. It was a strange
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It's weird because I was born in '93, so I didn't get to experience that time, but it seems like it almost flip-flopped today, where there's this ever-growing nuclear tension as more countries are coming online with nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons are becoming cheaper to mass produce, and the threat seems like it's becoming more and more imminent. But there's so much inundation of social media and TikTok and videos. There's so much pop cultural vomit to replace the fear of nuclear annihilation, that every time I bring it up with my friends or my or whoever, like just in casual conversation, like it's just like, oh yeah, like I guess it could happen, but it never goes beyond that. But then when I started diving into nuclear history, there's more than a handful of times where there's been near accidental nuclear launches post Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and there's no reason to think that it can't happen again. But the fear seems like it's not as high as it should be. Uh, so I guess maybe it's similar to the time you grew up, because you also said the fear isn't as high as it should be, but you also have less. You didn't have social media. You didn't have as much distraction, so people had more time to focus on that nuclear threat.
It was the threat was everywhere. It was on the national news. It was on television programs. It was in Life magazine, Look magazine, Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest. It was everywhere. But back then, the threat wasn't as bad as it is now. The only threat we had was from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union, they weren't crazy. They weren't going to start a war just to start a war. They were like us. We had the equipment necessary to destroy the world. We didn't want to, and we did everything to prevent that. So there was a lot of worry, but not as much worry as there should be today when you have little countries making they got 70 atomic bombs in their stores ready to go, and you've got India against China, and China helping Pakistan because Pakistan's against India, and you've got Iran, maybe you got Israel's got nuclear weapons. I mean, somebody's gonna do something. So the the threat of nuclear annihilation is more real now than it ever was in the 50s, 60s, 70s. We had
Yeah.
one big adversary, but the adversary was surprisingly controlled and logical. They weren't just going to start a war. They knew that was going to tear up everything. But now you have Muslim countries that have a different view of the world and themselves. And you have, like I say, small countries with big bombs.
How do you think the smaller countries and countries with different ideologies coming online? You mentioned Muslim ideologies, and obviously not all people who practice Islam have a belief in jihad and taking over the world and eliminating Westerners. There's billions of practicing Muslims who don't associate at all with jihad, but there are a few, a very small percentage of those who believe that all Westerners and people who aren't Muslim essentially should be annihilated. And it does seem like if there was ever a time for those people to get their hands on nuclear weapons, it's right now. Do you see that progressing? Do you think more countries who have those sorts of ideologies will continue to get access to nuclear weapons?
I think it may progress as far as it's possible to progress without actually using the weapons. I'm hoping that the fact that they haven't used it yet means they aren't going to. Uh, it's it could go any way, of course, but I don't think that anybody who has nuclear weapons on a government scale is going to use them. Of course, the problem has been voiced that what if a real uh, smaller group that has no government support gets a hold of nuclear weapons? This is something that really bothered Jimmy Carter. He was afraid that a terrorist group was going to steal plutonium and build a bomb, and they would use it. They would have no reason not to. The problem was Jimmy Carter came into office uh, with the goal to get rid of nuclear power. And that's because he was getting his advice from uh, Rickover, the man who developed the nuclear submarine. And Rickover was his mentor. He would go to him with any nuclear problems. And Rickover was losing his mind, unfortunately, at that same time. He was becoming somewhat irrational, and the Navy had to retire him, and they had to get control of him. But he was affecting what Jimmy Carter thought. So Jimmy Carter came into office and he shut down the Clinch River breeder reactor, which is a interesting technology. It was an experiment to develop a commercial breeder reactor. It burns plutonium and it makes plutonium as it runs. In other words, it makes more fuel than it absorbs, that it uses, and therefore you have an unlimited supply of fuel for it. But it did burn plutonium, plutonium 239,
Hmm.
and president was afraid that if it was a commercial unit and not a military one, that it'd be easy for terrorists to take over, steal plutonium, and make a bomb. Well, what he didn't realize in all of this, and he killed the reactor program, he killed a fuel recovery program, and so on. And that pretty much halted the development of the breeder reactor. But the trouble with his reasoning was you can build a bomb with uranium 239, and that's special fuel made in converter reactors in the United States for use in bombs. But the plutonium that comes out of a breeder reactor is uranium 239 plus uranium 240. And the 240 makes it impossible to make a bomb with it because it reacts spontaneously and doesn't wait for a neutron to come around. So you can't
Hmm.
make a bomb with that. You can make a reactor fine, but the fact that uh, the the bred uranium in a breeder does not is not just the 239 made it impossible to use it. Of course,
How far did we get with that project? What did it get close to being a commercially viable reactor?
no, it was probably 20% finished when he shut it down. And
Could they have gotten further?
no,
Or do you think the idea wouldn't have it just wasn't feasible?
it was feasible, and it was a good step forward. Since then, we haven't done a lot of work with fast breeder reactors, but we've come up with the thermal breeder reactor. Thermal breeder reactors does not use plutonium 239, it uses uranium 233. And you get the uranium 233 from thorium. So
Hmm.
it uses thorium as fuel. It makes uranium 233, which is then used as fuel. And there's an unlimited supply of it. It's a simple process. We actually developed the thorium reactor, the molten core reactor, for the atomic airplane program in the
Hmm.
1960s. And interestingly, India is now deciding, well, we don't want to have to buy uranium from anybody else. We want to have our own fuel. and the fuel we have in India is thorium. So we should be working on the molten reactor uh, using thorium to make uranium 233, and they are pursuing that now. I think we
Hmm.
have a couple of programs that are uh, sort of looking at it, but it's not on the uh, primary development stage yet.
So if these reactors came online, would they be for house use, like personal homes? Would they be more for businesses? Like what would be the capability of the individual reactors, and what would it do to the traditional uh infrastructure, like the electricity companies and water companies that run everything with energy? Like what would it completely disintegrate those, or what would happen if these individual reactors came online?
The small reactors are they're a good uh, factor in deciding what we're going to do now. Uh, Small reactors have small problems. Small reactors can be built in a factory instead of having to build it out on the ground. I think it's a good idea. It could be anything from a uranium, just standard reactor using low enrichment uranium. It could be a plutonium reactor. It could be a breeder reactor. It could be a fast breeder reactor. It could be a thermal breeder reactor. It could be anything. And there's several companies now working on this actively. Uh, it's looking interesting, but we haven't exactly implemented it yet. There's not one making power. They will be
Mm,
small, and it would take the place of the huge, gigawatt reactors. Big reactors like that, they have big problems. But you can build a small reactor and put it in a hole in the ground, and you can control it with a laptop computer. That has a lot going
mm,
for it. But I must remind us all that the worst reactor accident in the United States was was with a small modular reactor. It was in 1960. The
mm,
Department of Defense wanted to build small reactors to use for remote military installations like in Greenland and Antarctica. So they came up with a design for a small reactor, just like what we're talking about here. And it was to be something that uh, enlisted men without a lot of training could assemble in the field, and they could do it in permanently frozen conditions like Greenland or Antarctica. And it was made as simple as possible. Plus, they didn't want to have nuclear scientists on board to keep them from melting it. And they set up an experiment in Idaho, out in the desert, where they uh, installed a reactor as if it were in Greenland, and they had enlisted men taking care of it, and they just sat back and said, "Let's see what happens." What happens was the thing exploded and completely wiped out the men working on it. There was a horrible, instantaneous explosion of the reactor, and learn from it.
yeah, yeah.
Problem was they had simplified it to the point where you could make the thing go critical with exactly one control. They did that just because it was cheap and simple. Well, that was a little bit too simple, too cheap. And the
Yeah.
guy got a hold of it, jerked the control out, and bang.
Yeah, you go through dozens and dozens of these types of accidents and these strange stories in both of your books, in Atomic Accidents and also Atomic Adventures. And I wanted to dive into a few of those in detail. And we spoke offline before the podcast, and we had spoken about Pakistan and India, and you also mentioned the relations between India, Pakistan, Iran, these smaller countries coming online, and something that you talk about in the book is this sort of like secret black market nuclear trade going on in this region. And I want to get into one guy in particular who I find fascinating, who's AQ Khan, Abdul Qadeer Khan. And he went from a respected scientist in the Netherlands to the most infamous smuggler in nuclear history.
Yes.
Tell me the story of how that happened.
Oh Lord. He was working, I think, in uh, Holland for Philips, and he found that if only he could sell this stuff that he was working on, he could make $1 million. He was working on a uranium enrichment scheme called centrifuge. Centrifuge was an old idea. In fact, it was used by the Germans during World War II for their bomb program, which didn't get anywhere. But it was still an interesting idea. We had the fusion and the magnetic enrichment facilities, which worked great, but this was even better if only you could do it. Well, we had enhanced methods by the 1980s and 90s, and Phillips was working on that. Kahn took those and uh, made his own company, and he would sell it to the highest bidder, and that included Iran, Iraq, and so on. The Chinese got interested in that. These small countries are making uranium for bombs. So they wanted to get in on it. They came up with a simplified bomb that was small, easy to make, and so on. And that was a way to get uh, small countries on their side, so to speak. It's called the Chick Five, I think, and
Mm.
that's what happened.
How did how was Khan operating this global smuggling network to evade detection for over 3 decades? Because he was doing this for so long.
He was doing it with the agreement of certain uh, governments, of course. We're not going to bother you as long as you sell us what we want, and that's the way he operated. He would go straight to the top, get to the government, and give them a reason for wanting him to succeed. In other words, we can outdo the United States, we can outdo Russia, we can outdo China, and it's going to be cheap.
Mm. So he was operating under the basis that countries wanted to come online with nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and he was cutting them a deal that, look, this may not be the top of the line stuff, but I'm gonna, I'm gonna be able to get it to you, and you can at least have the material and the infrastructure to build your own bombs.
It was a business model,
Yeah, black market. So you get what you get.
right?
What was what impact did he have on that region? Did Were there countries who essentially were able to come online because of AQ Khan? Did he continue to funnel in these black market nuclear resources? Basically, like, were countries coming online because of him that wouldn't have been able to otherwise if they went about it above board?
Absolutely. It was the program succeeded because of a huge uh, disagreement between Pakistan and India. India, of course, had the atomic bomb. They developed it themselves without a lot of help. They did have Canadian reactors, which helped them a lot. Canadians sold them a can do, and a can do can operate as a plutonium production reactor. It wasn't built for that, but if you use it just right, you can make plutonium. And Canadians told them not to do that, but they did it anyway, and they came up with their own uh, independent uh, atomic bomb program. This made China nervous because they share uh, ground there, and China was afraid that, well, we've got the atomic bomb as long as nobody else has it. But when India had it, then they got really perturbed. So they wanted to help Pakistan on the other side of India get the bomb and keep India under control in that way. So that's why China came up with the bomb design, and uh, Khan had the uh, uranium purification program with his centrifuges. And Pakistan saw the definite advantage of being able to uh, counteract any uh, problem with India, saying, we've got the atomic bomb and you've got the atomic bomb. They were careful to do a test of their bomb that India was certain to record.
Yeah, that seems like a logical next step is that to make something more safe, you introduce more nuclear weapons into the situation.
Right. You make it more dangerous to make it safe.
Yeah. Yeah, why this seems like such a dumb obvious question, but why is it always the case that when superpowers want safety, they tend to increase the nuclear supply rather than work on limiting the supply of nuclear weapons, which would then limit the chances of one going off or one being used to solve a conflict?
But the odd thing about nuclear weapons are it's the ultimate weapon and you can't use it. Because if you use it, you're going to destroy civilization. And is that the point of war? So we have, you know, billions, trillions of dollars worth of research, and we have nuclear weapons that are very, very advanced. They're getting more advanced all the time. We're working on them right now, but we can't use them for anything. So it's
Yeah,
simply a threat that, and I can't think of why we would use it. Uh,
yeah. It is like a dick measuring contest that just has no limit because
exactly.
you can only use so many inches. Like there's no point if someone says I have a 10-inch dick, there's no point in saying, "Well, I have a 25-inch dick." Like
Right.
you can't beyond a certain point it doesn't make a difference with nuclear weapons. What's the difference between having 100 or 100,000 if the world is going to end with one?
Yeah.
If one gets launched and one gets launched back, and then boom, the world's in a fireball. There is this sort of pointless posturing that goes along with developing a nuclear arsenal.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah. Going back to AQ Con, do you think there are other AQ cons out there today running these secret nuclear black markets?
Oh yeah, it's like cocaine. It becomes a very lucrative way to make money. It's you make a lot of money quick, and if you pay the right people, you can get away with it. What can I tell you? It's just
Where do you
another way to make a fortune.
Where do you think the epicenter of the black market is based today, or is it so dispersed that There's no real central location for black market nuclear weapons.
Well, for some reason, it's not really that popular in the Western Hemisphere, like South America. Now, they have all kinds of problems with various regimes, but I don't think anybody there is really thinking about nuclear weapons. Canada, they'll use some nuclear weapons if they get them from us, but they're not really developing nuclear weapons. Mexico isn't developing nuclear weapons. Uh, but the Eastern Hemisphere, North Korea. North Korea
North Korea.
that's the bad boy. North Korea wants South Korea. And China, unfortunately, obviously has to be helping them because China wants for South Korea to be controlled. They want to take over Taiwan, and they don't want for South Korea to prevent them from doing that. So they're helping North Korea in many ways, giving them design uh, of weapons and weapons delivery systems, everything that they need from rubber for tires to paint on the trucks.
Yeah. Yeah, North Korea seems like such a unique situation because you have a country that seems like without nuclear weapons, it would be like stepping on an ant because their military is not that big compared to other superpowers. Their country seemingly has millions of starving people that are being taken advantage of and wouldn't be any use defending their nation. But you add in a nuclear weapon supply, and all of a sudden, countries want to listen to what Kim Jong Un has to say.
They can't possibly feed their population. What do they need with nuclear weapon?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's so it does feel like I'm looking into an alternate universe. I mean, a lot of news feels like that today, but especially when you see the videos come out of North Korea where Kim Jong Un's making these Top Gun style slow motion videos with ICBMs in the background, and there's 11 million people starving in his country, but he's blowing money on computer graphics and having missiles
Right.
upright behind him, giving the finger to the camera, swinging his dick around. Like, it just seems like such an odd, dark, and apocalyptic scenario to be in a country like North Korea.
It does. Not sure what to do about it, but North Korea is a problem, and they don't have to be. They could we could help them if they need. Tell us what you need, as long as it's not a huge weapon system.
Yeah. Yeah, and apparently Kim Jong Un is the number one buyer of Hennessy on the planet. So you have a country
Yeah,
that is big dick swinging with nuclear weapons and a leader who's probably somewhere on the spectrum of buzz to shit face 24/7
yeah,
with his hand hovering over the button. It does feel like a comic book villain. It is pretty wild.
yeah. It is, and it's one guy apparently.
Yeah. So taking a step back, you mentioned being born in the 50s. Obviously, you're around the time of the atomic bomb drops, and one of the most infamous, historically highlighted projects of nuclear weapons is the Manhattan Project. And during the Manhattan Project, it was a unique time because the urgency of building the bomb often outweighed safety concerns. Can you talk about the high risk environment of the Manhattan Project and how that urgency shaped nuclear science at the time?
Ooh boy. I went to school, Georgia Tech, and started in 1969. Had physics professors who'd worked on the Manhattan Project. Uh, Back then, you could talk to guys about it, and it was all top secret, still was top secret, but you could get them loosened up. And
Couple glasses of Hennessy.
yeah,
They'll tell you where they're getting their uranium supply from.
yeah, yeah, it was, and we at Georgia Tech, we didn't just have a reactor; we had three reactors. And our big reactor used 93% enriched bomb grade fuel. It was metal uranium with aluminum, metal uranium plus aluminum, easy to get the uranium out of it. And we had stored away enough spare fuel, to run the thing for 100 years. That was just the big reactor. We also had a small reactor, used fuel surplus from Oak Ridge, and so on. We also had another small reactor, used 20% enriched fuel. Uh, and this was on a campus, without locked doors. I mean, it was uh, it
Crazy times.
was a crazy time. It was an amazing time. But what I would get from talking to people who worked on the project was there was nothing safe about it, but few people died. I think two men died during the Manhattan Project from being exposed to radiation.
Mm.
Radiation safety was a new concept back then. In fact, Casey Morgan was the man who invented radiation safety, called it health physics. And I took health physics from Casey Morgan. He taught at Georgia Tech. And he had some stories that I could write a book about them, but
Well, you did. You mentioned there's one it's sorry to cut you off. It just made me think about the early radiation stories you tell. I think this is in Atomic Accidents where people were first playing around with X-ray machines and they were
uh
putting their hands in front of it and putting their face in front of it. And one of the scientists realized that he felt more sleepy if he put his face in front of the X-ray machine, and so he was writing notes as if it was some sort of insomnia cure or sleep cure that you could just X-ray yourself and pass out, and little did he know that it's just his central nervous system being assaulted by, radioactive particles. But there yeah, you have a few of those stories in there where it's like, that wasn't that long ago, but people were sort of like hawking these radiation cures, X-ray cures before we fully understood what it was.
yeah, that was Nikola Tesla, man for
Yeah.
whom the Tesla car is named. He was the one who discovered X-rays, but he didn't really see what it was good for, except to help him go to sleep.
I bet it did.
Yes,
I bet it and then you wake up with 3 heads.
it was a lot of learning had to be done about radiation exposure. In fact, we went into World War II, went through World War II, and the only indication we had that radiation was really dangerous was the radium girls. That was women who were paid to write the numbers on a watch or a clock with radium so that the numbers would glow at night. And it was an alpha emitter, which was very dangerous. And unfortunately, they had to point the brush by rolling it in their tongue, so they would be ingesting radium. And radium
Mhm.
your body looks at radium and says, "What is this? How can we use this?" And it says, "Well, it looks like calcium." As it turns out, the bones in your body are constantly fixing themselves. Uh, and the bone that has the most need for fixing is your jaw. You don't realize that when you're chewing food, you're actually destroying the bone structure. It has to completely rebuild it, rebuild it, rebuild it. So it started putting radium in their jaws, and it causes severe deterioration of everything. Uh, it's not mineral, and you get cancer and radiation poisoning and everything else. And from this, the scientists with the Manhattan Project knew that, yes, you're going to have some problems by releasing a great deal of radiation in a bomb. But they really didn't know how bad it would be until they started analyzing the results of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Now, the bombs that dropped there were just a flash, literally, a millisecond flash of radiation. And to get really sick from radiation, it's like you're painting dials on watches. You get it every day for years, and from that, you eventually die from it. But when you get one flash, that's not the same. It just is able to interact with your body on a very limited time based method. So they didn't see so much of that because of the bomb drop. What they saw eventually was radiation exposure for long periods of time for people living in radioactive debris in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And from that, they started to get the idea that yes, fallout is dangerous. And fallout became a huge detriment to uh, making tests above ground and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Because a lot of the initial burns, right, were from light, not radiation, which
Right.
I thought was fascinating. I
Yeah.
didn't know that you could get burned by light.
If it's bright enough, it's like staring into a searchlight or something. You get
Yeah.
an instant sunburn. Very,
Yeah.
very effective.
But is it were they getting burned in the same way that you would get a UV burn from the sun, or was it that the light was so strong from the bomb that, like, the UV content didn't matter? It's just the light is gonna overwhelm your skin.
It's just like sunlight times 100. It was the UVB, UVC that was causing the burning.
Mm,
It's like you get if you sit out in the sun without a sunscreen.
yeah. You mentioned there were only a couple deaths during the Manhattan Project, despite the loose safety concerns, uranium doors being left unlocked.
Yep.
Did you ever hear any stories from your professors around that time? Maybe something they shouldn't have told you, or just something that stuck with you throughout the years that you heard from a professor who was working on the Manhattan Project?
Uh, One guy who I will not name uh, was teaching people how to assemble the bombs,
Oh God.
and that was a very dangerous thing to do because uh, you know uh, you had to.
He's not even a physics teacher. He's like teaching geology. He's like, guys, I'm gonna teach you how to make a bomb today.
Well, he was teaching people during the
Yeah.
Manhattan Project. It was
Yeah.
all secret, but he could loosen up and he could tell me what they were doing and how dangerous it was. They when they started building uh, the implosion bombs using plutonium is much more complicated than the assembly bomb used in the first one they dropped. Incredibly, the first bomb they ever dropped was on Hiroshima, and it was never tested. That was the first explosion they'd ever had of uranium in that bomb. But
Hmm.
the problem with that thing is that it was a cylinder with a hole in it, and it was supposed to then mate with a, a cylinder that would fill up the hole and make it a supercritical assembly. And if you dropped the thing and it fell on the ground, it could assemble itself and explode. And they were very concerned about that. So they put copper screws in it to keep it from assembling by itself. You could drop it and it would hit the screws and stop. And the only way you get through the screws was to put some big block of gun cotton behind it and blow it in like it was a, a howitzer or something, and
Hmm.
it would do that. But then there was the plutonium bomb, and for that you had this sphere plutonium, and you had to put that on the end of a stick and insert it into the center of the bomb, and then you put the explosive over it. And the trouble is, it had around that thing, around the bomb, it had a layer made of uranium 238. They used the uranium 238 because it was heavy. It was not a readily uh, fused uh, uh, isotope like uranium 235. You can make a bomb out of it, but it was uranium still, and it would go radioactive when you hit it with neutrons. And they would
Hmm.
put this plutonium sphere in the thing and have to go through a hole in this uranium cover. And as it went through, the thing would go supercritical. So you're starting a nuclear reaction just by assembling the thing. They had to do it quickly, or it would melt down and it would kill everybody within 30
Yeah.
feet of it. And that was something that you had to teach these guys how to do. Put it
Yeah.
in, don't hesitate, and don't pay any attention to the Geiger counters that are going crazy when you do it. And that seemed very dangerous to me. It would be easy to drop it, or lose it, and thing would go off.
Yeah. And you had a professor that was just going through all of this in class. Just by the way, guys, if you're wondering why I submitted your papers late last week, it was because I was building an atomic bomb and this is how you do it.
He wouldn't do it during the classroom. I had to go to him after class.
Okay, yeah, so it was more of an after hours
Oh
special.
yeah, oh yeah.
That's I mean, it's amazing that with the lack of safety and obviously the security if you have people that are just talking about it to people involved in the Manhattan Project that are talking about it to people who don't have a security clearance that the way that we built the bomb didn't leak earlier to Russia or Japan or Germany that we still managed to build the bomb first or use it first at least.
Russia was aware of the bomb from the very beginning. They had the Russia has the best spy network of anybody. At least it used to back in the Soviet Union days. They had better spy networks than anybody else in the world. They knew how to do spy networks. Felix was head of the KGB back then, and he would help the Soviet Union come into existence by using spy networks. And let me tell you this: we built the first reactor in Chicago. Uh, Enrico Fermi invented the thing. They built it in the squash court underground. It's a completely secret project, utterly top secret. but it was made of blocks of graphite that were stacked on the ground into a big block. And as they were building the thing, one guy dropped one of these blocks and it cracked in two. He didn't want to go back and get a new one, so he just looked around, saw nobody was looking, put it together, and used it to build the bomb. Well, you know, 50 years later, we got to look at the first Russian reactor. It was an exact copy of the one in the squash court in the University of Chicago, right down to that broken block down in the thing.
Yeah.
You know, they saw this guy drop it and break it, so they dropped it and break it when they made theirs.
Yeah, that's hilarious. They thought it was on purpose. So Louis, or sorry, not Louis. It's Louis Slotin and Harry Dalian.
Oh yeah,
Were those the two guys you were talking about that died
oh
during
yeah.
the Manhattan Project?
Louis,
So they were two of the most infamous tragedies in early nuclear history, both
absolutely.
fatally exposed to the demon core while they were working on it.
Hmm.
Tell me about the demon core and how it sparked the accidents of Dalian and Slotin.
Well, of course, you had to build a sphere of plutonium, but to see if that was going to work, you had to test it for activity. In other words, under what conditions would that thing go critical? And you had to make sure it was not going to go critical when you assemble a thing and that it would go critical when you collapse the bomb. And that was a very sensitive adjustment that had to be made. You couldn't really uh, use a computer program and simulate it, they weren't that accurate. You had to have accuracy of actually measuring the activity of the plutonium core. And the way to do that is to do it remotely, where you have, a TV camera on the thing and you're looking at it. You have a remotely operable thing. Use a joystick to put the thing together, and you're looking at the dials to see how radioactive it gets when you assemble it. That's the way to do it. But they didn't see the need back then. Uh, it'd be a lot of trouble to do it. Why don't we just do it by hand? So you're supposed to take this sphere of plutonium and approach it with components that would be in the bomb and see if it goes supercritical. Thing is barely subcritical. So you have to make sure that nothing is reflecting neutrons back into it, which make it uh, fission and so on. And if it does so, is it enough to make it run away and get you know uh, melted?
Yeah.
So Slotin, he was a he was a wild man. He always did things that were dangerous. In fact, he first worked at Oak Ridge on the X-10 reactor. He worked for KZ Morgan, and Morgan wanted him out of the program. He said, "You've got to get rid of this guy. He's too careless with radiation." Well, he was from Canada, and he was a nuclear physicist, and there was a shortage of nuclear physicists. They wanted to not get rid of any of them, so they sent him to Los uh, Alamos, and he worked there, and he would do things that nobody else would do, and that made him valuable. They needed somebody to test this core, and he could do it with his eyes closed. He was a wild man, and so he's training somebody. They didn't want just one guy who could do it, so he's training this fellow, and he slipped with a screwdriver, and the thing dropped too close to a component and went supercritical instantly and bathed them with radiation. The guy who was instructing was standing behind him, and Slotin shielded him from a lot of the radiation. Guy, his name was Grove, I think. He uh, he survived it. He went on to do a lot of work for Castle Bravo testing in the Pacific Ocean. But Slotin died a quick death. It was really bad. Then Daghlian did basically the same thing. And when Daghlian did it, they said, we got to change this. The entire procedure went remote. And then and now they don't get anywhere within 3 miles of a assembly, and they do it by remote control with TV cameras.
Mm. They learned their lesson from freestyling with a screwdriver.
Took too long to learn that.
Yeah. What happens to the body during acute radiation poisoning to the body and the mind? Are you feeling pain right away? Does it start to burn? Do you feel like an overwhelming sensation of some sort, or is it more like the flash happens and you just know you're screwed, and eventually you start to feel the symptoms?
You know you're screwed because you can feel the heat. It,
Mm.
the neutron flux heats up everything in your body. You feel the flash. It only lasts for a second or so, but you know that, I've done it. And within an hour, you start throwing up. You can't keep anything down. Uh, your body wants to get rid of everything it can. Only thing it can get rid of is what's in your digestive system, and that doesn't work. But you get over it, and you start feeling better. You start feeling like this is going to go away, and then it hits you, and your blood dies, your bones die, your liver dies, everything dies. The last thing to go is your brain. Your brain is not that sensitive to radiation, but it's sensitive to the effects of your bloodstream not working and so on. It's not a good way to go. And of
Yeah.
course, your extremities start turning black. First, your fingers and your hands and your forearms and your upper arms and everything, your legs, everything dies.
Yeah. That's I mean, I'd rather just get shot in the face at that point. Like I would think that if I got the burn where I was exposed to radiation to the point where I knew I was going to die, you're being kind to yourself by putting a bullet in your head.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, that's a rough way to go.
it's been thoroughly documented now. We know what happens when you're 3 feet away from
Yeah.
an incident like that.
But at that point, did those guys know the full ramifications of what they were about to go through, or was it still sort of a mystery what would happen if you felt that neutron flash?
They pretty much knew what was going to happen.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
you can
That's
feel it in
rough.
your bones, the heat. And you know that
Yeah.
you've been saturated with a huge blast of radiation,
Yeah.
and your
That's
body has been activated. In other words, ordinarily non-radioactive elements in your body have been made radioactive by neutron capture. So that's a problem with a criticality accident. Most of your radiation is in the term and is in uh, neutrons and gamma rays.
mm,
The gamma rays, that's like being burned by the sun times 100. But the neutrons, that heats up everything in your body instantaneously and causes radiation to occur days later in your body just by activation.
so if you play with plutonium, you don't turn into the Hulk, is what you're saying.
No, it doesn't happen.
The opposite. You mentioned Fermi before, and one of the most fascinating parts of the book that I had no idea that this was part of the Manhattan Project history, but the Oppenheimer Fermi letters, which Enrico Fermi and Robert Oppenheimer allegedly discussed the idea of using radioactive poisoning as a weapon if they didn't build a bomb in time. What exactly were they proposing, and how far did that go?
That didn't go very far. That was simply, they didn't really have 100% confidence that this thing was going to work at all. This is the first time it had ever been done. You know, no one had ever built a bomb with uranium before, and it was something brand new. So they had to think of ways to justify these billions of dollars if it didn't work. Well, at least we've got some radioactive material that we can use to kill people, and that, of course, turned out to be not necessary in the slightest way. So they didn't really pursue that. But it was
Mm,
trying to come up with uh, reasons for having spent all this money.
yeah. What, what was their, like, did they have a plan of what the scale was gonna be if they developed a nuclear poison, or did it not get beyond the discussion stages?
Didn't get. It was basically to uh, placate the generals in charge, and it wasn't a serious development project at the time.
Yeah. So it really came down to bureaucracy, which is we have the money, so we gotta spend it somehow.
Right.
And Oppenheimer and Fermi were like, "I guess if the bomb doesn't work, maybe we could just slide some uranium into chicken." I don't know. I don't know what the plan was, but yeah.
It was like the Germans didn't really have a bomb in mind, but they thought, well, we can drop a, a reactor on the Americans, and
Just see what happens.
it's, it was
Yeah.
it was really.
Yeah, that would be the most, disappointing and also relieving nuclear accident at the same time, as if someone just dropped a reactor and it landed in a field and didn't explode, and the Germans would be so angry, but then at the same time, the Americans would be like watching something fall from the sky, thinking, "Oh my god, this is it, this is it." Some farmer is just like ripping a cigarette, taking a shot of whiskey. This is the end, and then a reactor just hits the ground and nothing happens.
The German scientists who all worked on the bomb project in Germany, they were captured after the war, and they were holed up in a house in England, and it was all recorded. They had hidden microphones so they could see what they're talking about. And what they got was the Germans, when they learned of the bomb drop on Hiroshima, they were really wondering, how did the Americans have a airplane that was big enough to carry a reactor over Japan? you know, they thought they must have a monster bomber. It's got to be, a mile long. And they
Yeah.
didn't, at that time, it didn't occur to them that they actually make a fairly small bomb and just drop it.
Mm.
That was how far they'd gotten or didn't get with their bomb project.
Yeah. You you would think with the just the organizational prowess of the Nazis, that they would realize that you can't fit a reactor into a plane. You would have thought they would have gotten at least that far, because they seemed really good at like pressing uniforms straight and lines, like they would have been aware of the proportions of what you can and can't carry. That maybe someone would have been like, "Sir, I don't think you can fit the bomb and the whole reactor in the plane. You have to compact it into a," like, I guess that they were too busy, with other horrific plans.
Yeah, they the bomb project was not on the on the list really of uh, immediate needed
Yeah.
things. In fact, their whole idea was let's make a power source for submarines so that U-boats don't have to come up uh, and recharge the batteries. That was their thought about nuclear power, and it was a
Mm,
good thought. You know, eventually we implemented that, but they weren't really thinking about making an atomic hand grenade or anything.
yeah. I want to fast forward a few decades to Chernobyl. And like most atomic accidents that you cover in the books, Chernobyl wasn't just an accident. It was a chain reaction of bad design, poor training, human error. What do you see out of those factors as the single biggest factor that doomed Reactor 4 that night?
That was a horrible design. It was a Soviet design, and there was nothing safe about it. Uh, the way the controls worked, uh, the shielding, everything was badly designed. But the worst thing was they didn't have any reactor operators that were trained and understood reactor dynamics, reactor how a reactor works, and so on. What they had was some guys who'd worked in a coal plant, you know, working the boilers, and they used them as reactor operators. And they didn't understand such things as uh, iodine poisoning, which causes a reactor to shut itself down if your uh, if your power level is high enough, and so on. And they didn't understand how the controls worked, and so on. And it was just ignorance of some basic uh, reactor dynamics, reactor theories, and so on that caused them to mishandle the controls. Controls were very easily mishandled, and the design was very poor. It was designed to make as much plutonium as possible while doing a separate job of making power for a big radar installation that was 3 miles away. In the United States, we did some things wrong and we did some things that were very right. One thing we did very right was we in no way used a converter reactor making plutonium to also make electric power. Their problem was they wanted to make electric power and they wanted to make plutonium. These are two different problems requiring different types of reactor, different types of control, and so on. And to try to do it both in one turned out uh, a disaster.
Hmm. Did you watch the Chernobyl HBO series?
Yes, quite good.
What were your thoughts on that? What stood out to you about the Chernobyl series?
Well, there was a couple of things that were just totally wrong. They showed a helicopter flying over the reactor, and the radiation was so intense that the helicopter pilot lost control and crashed. That didn't happen. Yes, it was radioactive, but it's not so radioactive that you can't fly over it in a helicopter and survive the flight. I mean, it doesn't, radiation poisoning doesn't work that fast at that level. Uh, that was just something they wanted to use for the drama of it, but that didn't happen. And aside from that, it was pretty good. Especially, I liked the part where they wanted to use some German technology. They had these robots that could, you know, be sent to remove radioactive parts and put them in a box and ship them away. So they got this German company that was making robots that would work in high radiation. And the Germans asked, "Well, how much radiation is going to be there?" And they gave them, well, the official number, which is quite large. They said, "Well, that's very big, but we can handle it." And they put the robot at the reactor. The robot immediately died, just stopped
Yeah.
working. And they said, "Why has that happened? We gave them uh, the radiation level." Said, "You idiot! We gave them the wrong radiation level. We gave them the radiation level we give to the public, not the real radiation level."
Yeah, we gave him a propaganda.
Yes, yes, and that's the way the Soviet Union, worked. There was the stuff that
Yeah.
you could tell people and stuff that you didn't tell people. But if
Yeah.
you're going to use that for a technical purpose, you got to use the real number. That didn't occur to them.
Yeah. What about the scene where the firefighters and the workers go on the roof of reactor 3 and they start their vision starts blurring. It's like an immediate obvious burning slash melting sensation that they're experiencing on the roof of reactor 3. Do you think something like that would have happened on the night of Chernobyl?
That happened.
Hmm.
That time, everything was severely radioactive. Uh, the thing hadn't been refueled in a long time. All of its fuel was radioactive. Everything about it was radioactive. It was blown all over the place. And they were in the top of the destroyed reactor trying to do something, and you can't just do that without dying. That was horrible. That
Hmm.
actually happened.
Yeah.
In fact, they lost, what, 75 people from radiation poisoning?
Something like that.
And
Yeah.
that was what caused it. Just using human beings and poor human beings can't survive. You can't do that. You have to find another way to get it gone. And the trouble is, they had to get rid of it as soon as possible, and you can't do that. It took decades to get that controlled, but that's the way
Yeah.
you had to do it.
So there's another part where the show suggests that an even more catastrophic explosion could have wiped out Europe if not for a last minute intervention. And I think that was when they sent in the worker, like the extra guys who were digging the tunnels, and they asked them if they wanted suits, and they said no, we'll just go in with our bare shirts. Like it doesn't matter at that point. And the operation was to prevent the molten core from reaching the underwater ground reservoirs. Was this a real possibility that if the core reached the water reservoirs that could have ignited a gigantic continent-wide explosion?
I think that was an exaggeration, to tell you the truth. Uh, I can understand that being worried about that. I mean, this has never happened before, and there was a lot that had to be learned and learned quickly. But as far as that secondary explosion, nah. The trouble with the reactor was it was blown to pieces. It was all over the place. It was hundreds of feet away, and you couldn't really uh, establish a criticality or even a super hot uh, region because of uh, the extra heating of uranium after it's been run, because everything was so dispersed, everything was blown apart. You couldn't really get it together enough to
Mhm.
cause that kind of secondary problem.
Yeah. And the bridge of death scene where everyone gathers on the bridge in Pripyat to watch the reactor burning and the fires, hundreds of meters into the sky. And the implication in the show is that everyone standing at on that bridge is going to perish from radiation poisoning. Would that be accurate to you?
Not really, it's too far away. and also it just starts with this white flash. It looks
Hmm.
like an atomic bomb went off, and that was a bit of an exaggeration. But
What about the blue light after that? Is that realistic? I forget what it's called, like the Cherenkov radiation.
yes,
Is that something that
yeah,
actually happens?
that was lighting up the nitrogen in the sky from radiation. That happens.
Mm,
In fact, if you remember in my book, every time a reactor blows up, it's a blue flash.
yeah,
That's the nitrogen going.
yeah. So that part's accurate, but the people on the bridge, they most likely would have survived for a longer time than implied
Yeah,
in
they
the
were,
show.
miles away.
Yeah.
Uh,
The Yeah, the radiation is fascinating to me, and you also talk about this a lot in the book, the psychology behind
right,
radiation fear, the radiophobia, and Chernobyl is one of those events that's burned into the mind of the masses as this ultimate nuclear nightmare, even though oil and gas accidents have taken countless more lives than nuclear reactor
right.
accidents. Like it's not even close. What to you drives the public's hyperbolic fear of reactors and radiation?
Well, the problem was the human race was first exposed to the concept of nuclear power by dropping two bombs on Hiroshima, and that became the benchmark for what happens when uranium uh, does that. Uh, what can I say? That and fallout, fear of fallout, fear of
Yeah,
everything nuclear. Of course, you should be afraid of it, but not to that point. Uh, you're very careful when you work in a reactor. You know that thing wants to blow up. You don't want radiation on yourself, so you have a lot of caution. You have radiation equipment that tells you how much radiation is in the atmosphere at any time, and so on. So if you work in it, you're very careful with it, but you're not really afraid you're going to die.
yeah, yeah. If we had solar power bombs that blew up Nagasaki and Hiroshima, people would probably be deathly afraid of solar panels
I
today.
tell you,
We that it seems like a huge part of it. The as you mentioned, the you know the global red carpet of atomic power, of nuclear power, was the bomb and the devastation and all of the stories, both true and not true. There's a lot of mythology around radiation and what happens. That sort of all comes together over the last century, almost a century at this point, to create this unequivocal fear in people's minds about the power of radiation and how harmful it actually is. Not that it's completely unfounded, but it just doesn't match the proportions of the actual threat.
it's not unfounded. The trouble with radiation is that you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it, and the effect can be delayed by as much as 20 years. See, that's what's so psychologically harmful about it.
It's like love.
Indeed.
They should the nuclear or the like the atomic board of physicists should run some marketing campaign saying that radiation is just like love. You can't see it, you can't feel it, but it'll affect you somehow.
That's right.
Whether it's today or 20 years down the line. It'll it'll either make your life 10 times better or 10 times worse
Uh,
depending on how
that's
the
absolutely
story
right.
ends up. Yeah. Um, but yeah, no, I just wanted to get into that because I do think the psychological aspect of it is very fascinating.
Right.
So you to completely just change topics, you devoured a lot of science fiction and UFO lore when you were a kid.
Yeah,
What book or story drew you into that world? How did you get into UFO world?
that's a good question. There were several books. Well, science fiction gets you started. I was reading science fiction magazines. It was Analog, and when I was in elementary school, and there was some Frenchman who was writing books about uh, flying saucers at the time. There's a book in my school library, which I still have. I can't remember the name of it, but it's in here somewhere. In fact, I took that book home. But there was in the 1950s, particularly, there's a lot of science that had to do with UFOs. In fact, the Air Force had the Blue Book project where they were finding out things about uh, things that people have seen in the night sky and so on. And most of it, of course, was just people looking at planets and airplanes and things. But there were a few that were interesting, and you get to the point where you think we can't be the only people who are alive in the universe. You know, they say there are two possibilities: either we're absolutely alone, or the universe is full of people. Either is quite frightening. But
Mm,
yeah, when I was in elementary school, I was studying books about flying saucers. I figured if somebody wrote a book about it, it's got to be true, right?
yeah, same thing with the internet.
Yeah, precisely.
If it's on there, it has to be accurate.
Uh-huh.
The 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 Roswell incident is something we spoke about
Mhm,
offline,
mhm.
and you had mentioned to me that you could give me an explanation of the Roswell incident. And for people who aren't aware, the Roswell UFO story, it's been analyzed, it's been mythologized, it's been weaponized for conspiracy theories, even. But it's one of the most talked about, explored incidents of UFO lore. So tell me about Project Mogul, its connection to Roswell, and your meeting with physicist Judge Ellison.
Yes, I was convinced long ago that the Roswell incident was not a UFO, that it was due to balloons they were using. And I read the 2 volumes of research that was released by the United States government in the 1990s about the Roswell incident and so on. But when I met Judge Ellison at Georgia Tech, when I was working on another project, I found someone who worked on that project, Project Mogul, in Roswell, New Mexico, and he knew exactly what had happened. So it turns out these balloons they'd send up, it wasn't just a balloon, it was a string of 30 balloons strung together in a long line of balloons. And the thing was made so that it would rise in the atmosphere until it got too high in the atmosphere. It would recognize that because it had an altimeter on board, and it would release the top balloon. So you'd lose some of your uh, lifting capability, and the thing would come down to a decent altitude. And then one of those things to just fly around very high in the atmosphere so they could detect uh, Soviet atomic bomb testing. Because atomic
Mm,
bomb testing puts a shock wave into the atmosphere. It's a sound so low you can't hear it. It's a low frequency sound. But if you make a microphone that is big enough, it can hear those low sounds. So these balloons be carrying up a microphone connected to a radio transmitter, and you're listening. You have a radar on the thing. It has a radar reflector on it, so you can track it with radar, so you know where it is, know how high it is, and you can hear what's coming in on that microphone. The microphone gives you a low frequency pulse. I think that's got to be a test of a nuclear bomb. So that's what they were for. And Ellison had uh, invented and worked on the microphone that would work on it. And it was a big disc. It looked like a snare drum or something. And they called him the flying disc. That was
Mm.
the name that
Flying saucer, yeah.
they called.
Flying disc, flying saucer, yeah.
And when one of those things went down in a storm, it was all very, very secret. You didn't want the Soviets to know that we were listening in the atmosphere to their atomic bomb explosions. And for that reason, it was top secret. So when the thing came down on a guy's farm, you had to not tell him exactly what it was, but you had to go out and get the stuff off his farm. And they have an officer who works with the local publications, the newspaper and so on, the journalists, and he's supposed to tell them what happened, but not really tell them what happened. And he said, well, this thing landed and it was a flying disc. And they took that to mean it was a flying saucer and it was from another planet. And the thing
Mm.
got out of control just because of what he had said. And then this guy in Washington State was flying an airplane near in the mountainous region of Washington State. And he saw these things flying around. It looked like they were connected, because they were all following each other. And he said they looked like flying saucers. That's where the whole flying saucer frap began. But what he was seeing was the fact that one of these strings of balloons, which are made to go up to Washington State and fly over the ocean and end up in Siberia, had gotten loose and was literally watching the string of balloons, which look like they're connected because they are connected, and the wind is blowing them around. And he said they look like flying saucers. So that's where it came from.
Yeah. I think that's something that doesn't get talked about enough with UFO and UAP sightings, which is that the assumption that a UAP is extraterrestrial or interstellar technology can work in the government's favor if they're testing out
Yeah,
classified military secrets, which is what I suspect was happening in New Jersey with the increase in these strange drones is that maybe the military was testing a new technology out and trying to see how civilians would react or trying to comb some swath of the population for data or geographical swarming, like whatever they were doing. It seems to me that the New Jersey drone situation, there's a high chance that it was a black military project and people said it's a UFO and then they just didn't say anything because the
absolutely.
vac the vacuum creates room for conspiracy and speculation, and if it works to the government's advantage, why would they come out and tell you what it actually is if the public creates the story for them?
The government does that all the time. They
It's actually genius. And I do think that there are a small number of UAP sightings that deserve further analysis and deserve our full attention, especially the ones that are reported by high level military pilots that seem unexplainable, but for the majority of them, the overwhelming majority, seems like their explanations, like the military using the public's assumption to its advantage, that completely explain what's going on.
Right, right. The military pilots who have a recording that they can show, that's the thing that's hard to explain. But you got to realize he didn't really see that thing. He was looking at his bomb site. He saw what the bomb site wanted him to see, and the bomb site is making a guess at what's there and is showing it, and it's probably a balloon that he's watching. And balloons can skeet away from you at very high speed just because your shock wave hits the balloon as you're flying past. It goes flying away. And it looks like the thing was able to, there's some machine in front of you was able to suddenly fly off at a 9-degree angle. But it's the same as uh, the drones over New Jersey. You know, a
Yeah.
drone has lights on it so you can see it. And do flying saucers really have running lights like that?
Yeah, I doubt they would wanna be seen unless they wanted to, if it was truly extraterrestrial
And there are
technology.
drones all over the place. Both military and news organizations use drones, architects use drones, and amateurs use drones. There are drones all over the
Yeah.
place now.
Yeah, well, you have a few drone sightings, and then very quickly, 95% of the sightings become other people sending up their drones to try to see what the drone is.
Right.
So it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy of like, look, they're not stopping. And the news that the drones are not stopping just perpetuates more people sending their amateur drones
Yep.
uh, into the sky. The interesting part about that whole incident is uh, some reports from the military about apparently trying to track the drones, and they were coming from somewhere out east over the water, and they weren't exactly sure where they were docking. They couldn't track the point of origin.
Mhm.
That to me is interesting because it doesn't seem like we have the type of technology where you can launch a drone from nothing. Like you need a base, you need a ship, you need something for it to charge, come into the air and go on over the eastern seaboard into New Jersey. You can't just have a drone come over the Atlantic Ocean with no source. So that to me is interesting. But 99% of the reports, I would think that those are just explainable by military operations or amateurs sending their drones up into the sky.
Yeah, the trouble with drones is you don't have, hundreds of miles of range, and you don't have much time in the air. You have minutes in the air usually, just because it takes so much electricity to keep one up in the air.
Yeah.
But believe it, there are military drones being designed with all speed now. Um China, United States, Great Britain, everybody's doing it.
Yeah. So Judge Ellison, who you mentioned you were working with, he was the guy who created the microphones for Roswell, the flying disc
Yep.
microphones. You also tell a story of your work with him taking a bizarre turn when he was tied up in a home invasion.
Yes.
What happened there?
Well, we were working on a thing called it's a cold fusion reactor, and we decided we'll keep it in your basement instead of mine. So he was working on that, and somebody rang the doorbell. Went to it, and there was a guy wanting something, and it turns out he wanted to rob Judge Ellison of all his valuables. He made it in and held a gun on him, and Ellison was tied up. The guy took his watch and everything, and uh, demanded his car keys. He went downstairs, got in Ellison's Mercedes diesel, cranked it up, and by that time, Ellison had freed himself of his bonds. He had a 22 rifle that was handy. He took that and he closed the garage door as the guy was trying to get out. He blasted through the garage door, sped off, and uh, Ellison managed to knock out his rear window with his 22 rifle. Found the car, the police did, about 3 miles away at a MARTA station for the subway. And I think they finally found the guy and arrested him. But
Hmm.
that was a weird, weird thing. Ellison, of course, lived in a fancy neighborhood as Brookwood, had a house probably worth $1 million, and he was therefore ripe for the picking.
And you guys were both working on the reactor that he was keeping in his basement together, because you told me you were playing a big part in cold fusion at the
Oh
time.
yeah, oh yeah,
Tell me about your work in cold fusion.
oh boy. Well, cold fusion was a surprise. It came about because Pons and Fleischmann were a couple of uh, electrochemists in Utah, and they were working to make uh, hydrogen isotopes fuse. Therefore, this would be a groundbreaking power source, and they could do it without all this heavy equipment and severe temperatures and everything. They call it cold fusion. They were going to do that by using a strange property of palladium. Palladium, for some reason, likes hydrogen. It'll soak up hydrogen wherever it can find it, soak up hydrogen in the air. And the hydrogen becomes part of the crystal lattice of the palladium. And Pons and Fleischmann reasoned that if palladium will soak up uh, hydrogen and put it in this matrix of palladium atoms, it becomes denser than anything that occurs in nature. It would be like hydrogen had been compressed to the point where it was a metal. And at that point, if you had two isotopes that would fuse together readily, then you'd have fusion in this tiny piece of palladium, and it would make power. And this would be as opposed to a big tokamak reactor like the building in Europe. It'd be inexpensive and small, and they call it cold fusion. So they tried it using tritium and deuterium. Deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen. Instead of just one proton, it has one proton, one neutron. You can get it to fuse with another tritium, then you get helium 4, which is a another atom entirely. So your hydrogen is turned into helium, and you get uh, a burst of energy from it, and that's something that could replace uranium fission, and it wouldn't have a lot of the bad aspects of fission. You wouldn't have severe radiation from it, for example. Well, as it turns out, it doesn't work like that. But
Hmm.
they were dealing with another person at another university in the same Utah, and he was about to release a paper where he described cold fusion. He found cold fusion because he was finding helium 3 in volcanoes. He said, how did helium-3 get in volcanoes? Well, it must have had fusion somewhere between tritium and hydrogen. And he therefore reasoned that it had to be cold fusion. So he's going to publish that. And Pons and Fleischmann found out that was going to be published, and they said, well, we've got to publish ours first so we get credit for it. So they called up the TV station and made an announcement to them. It got on public television in the United States, and we found out about it, and everybody else found out about it about the same instant. And it was a rush to find out who could first confirm the cold fusion as announced by Pons and Fleischmann. Turns
Do you
out
think that do you think the break-in had anything to do with the cold fusion reactor that you guys were working on in the basement, or was that just
I think
some guy,
it was utter chance. The guy didn't know what was
utter
working
chance?
on.
Yeah. So cold fusion, eh, did it ever turn into anything feasible, or it sort of just died with this presentation?
It well, it took it a while to die because, like I say, everybody across the world who was
Mhm.
a nuclear physicist wanted to try it, and that was us too. We wanted to try it, and we got we set up an experiment, and we were getting neutrons coming out of it, and you can't get neutrons out of anything that's not fusion. So it's just a glass of water with two electrodes in it and some palladium. So we decided, well, it's got to be fusion, so we announced it. And then in a few days, we found out that it wasn't neutrons at all that we were detecting. What it was the neutron detectors we were using were called BF3s, boron trifluoride. And if a neutron crosses the line with the boron, it causes the boron to activate, and it makes uh, a radiation event. You can detect that with electricity, and it becomes a blip on your screen, and that means that it has captured a neutron. As it turns out, the electron tube used as the detector has a very, very tiny leak in it because it's got a metal tube with a wire, like a metal wire going into it. They have to be electrically separated from each other so you can put a couple of thousand volts on it. And the metal and the glass of the uh, tube don't really make a good seal. When I say a good seal, I mean water on a molecular basis can get through that thing and into the tube. If that
Mm.
happens, then the water interacts with the fluorine with a bang, and it looks exactly as if a neutron was in there. So what we're doing is finding very low neutron radiation levels, like 1 per minute, which if you're using it for normal radiation counting, like from a nuclear reactor, that's just noise. But in this case, the noise looked like it was coming out of the experiment we were running. So we thought we were making neutrons, and that meant we were making cold fusion. We announced it, found out a couple of days that no, it was just water leaking into the tube on a molecule to molecule basis, and that looked like fusion. So we had another uh, press conference and announced that, and it the hit the world like a bomb.
Yeah, and a very expensive glass of water
Yes.
you guys had. Well, let's take a quick break, and I want to ask you a few more questions when we get back. I'm just gonna pee real quick, and then we'll start to wrap up.
I'll do the same thing. I'll see you in a minute.
All right. I just did some warm fusion into the toilet bowl.
Very good.
All right. So you write in your book, this is Atomic Adventures. You write that no subject of interstellar travel, no subject of interstellar travel being discussed today is remotely possible. If you had unlimited funding and resources, what technology would you invest in to unlock interstellar travel?
I'd start with interstellar communication. And for that, I'm currently investigating entanglement of gamma rays from cobalt 60. If you can find spontaneous type of entanglement, entangled particles, then that means that you don't have to force something to be entangled. It can just entangle naturally, which means that uh, star systems, black holes, that kind of thing, can be sources of entangled gamma rays, which are they can be a very high energy component of uh, interstellar radiation. In that case, there may be a way to communicate with a distant uh, planet by using a source of spontaneous gamma rays halfway between you and them. If you can ever find that there's somebody else in the universe, then you would work on how to get there. But so far, the only thing we have is radio signals, and radio signals have not found anybody anywhere, no matter how far we looked. So we need to look at some other way to communicate. The trouble is, the speed of light separates us from everybody else in the universe, even if they exist. We have to get beyond the speed of light somehow, and uh, a way to do that is possibly entangled radiation.
Do you think it's possible that other s- species, extraterrestrial civilizations are trying to communicate with us or, just sort of dispersing some type of faster than light communication out into the universe like entanglement, but we just don't have the ability to pick up on it. We don't have the technology.
It's possible, I suppose, but it's a big universe, and you'd have to be aiming directly at us for us to receive. Really not sure how that would work.
So
Frankly,
in theory, it has to be a very intentional
yeah.
communication.
And
It
what
wouldn't be
makes them,
something you just send out like radio waves.
yeah, yeah. We have sent out radio waves using the Arecibo thing, which is not no longer in existence, but that was our biggest um, antenna for many years. And we
Mm.
tried sending a radio message with that. Haven't gotten anything back yet. But the trouble is, somebody's got to be right in the path of that radio signal. Chances of that are near zero.
Mm.
So we're not advanced to the point where we have a clear way of communicating that doesn't involve radio, and we don't know who to try. What we're doing is very good. We've got the Webb telescope now, and we're seeing planets around stars, and we're starting to categorize those planets, finding that nothing's the same anywhere in the universe. All star systems are different. It's interesting finding. But we're finding some planets that would harbor life if life existed. But that's what we're doing, and we're doing that first. We're trying to find out what's in the universe. Is it possible that there are other people in the universe? And we'll have to figure out who
Mm,
to aim a signal at.
mm. Are you familiar with the Iron Man films with Robert Downey Jr.?
I think I saw two of them.
Do you know the whole concept behind the suit with the fusion inside the suit that's powering
Yeah, kind of.
the
Yeah.
would a nuclear power Iron Man suit actually be feasible?
Not really. I mean, uh,
I had to ask you.
yeah, it's an interesting concept, but to put enough power to be able to fly, for example, requires a lot of horsepower, and to put that in such a small space, you have to be able to cool something like that because it has a certain point at which it'll melt, and the point at which it will melt is near the point at which it's making maximum power. So, there are problems with tiny uh, sources of power like that. You have to have something that's
Mm,
making a nuclear type of power. The power we're used to is burning wood, burning coal, burning gasoline, gunpowder, that kind of thing. And you can get a lot of heat and power out of a shotgun shell. But that's all atomic energy. It's using differences in the atomic structure and not the nuclear structure. If you want to do with the nuclear structure, you're talking about something that's 3 to 5 million times more dense energy wise than burning coal, say.
mm,
So you can have a lot of huge amount of power coming out of a small thing using nuclear means, but the speed with which you can get it out is uh, a problem. When they discovered radium, it was immediately found that, yeah, it's 5 million times the amount per atom that you get out of burning anything, oxidizing something. But the trouble is, the energy only comes out at a certain rate. It's the decay rate of uranium. And they found out that they could definitely make a submarine. This is in the, you know, 1890s. They
mm.
found that they could make a submarine that runs on radium because they could put a big block of it in a submarine and it would get hot enough to make steam that could run the submarine. The problem was the entire world supply of radium was exactly 1 gram, so
Yeah,
that made it a problem. Another problem was you couldn't turn it off. It's always making this amount of
yeah,
energy.
yeah. I was gonna ask you this when we were talking about Roswell, but I completely skipped over it. Are you familiar with the book UFOs and Nukes by Robert Hastings?
No, it sounds interesting.
So Robert Hastings was an air traffic controller at Maelstrom Air Force Base,
Uh-huh.
and he experienced an incident where a UFO UAP shut down a nuclear missile silo, or it was perceived to be interacting with a nuke somehow. And Robert Hastings wrote this book not just about his experience, but about the supposed connection between UAPs and nuclear sites where either testing is going on or there are nuclear missile silos. Some UAPs have appeared around nuclear reactors, according to reports. And I wanted to ask you, in your work over the decades, have you ever heard about a story of weird UFO activity surrounding nuclear reactors or nuclear bases, nuclear testings? Have you ever run into a colleague that's mentioned something of the sort or something from nuclear history that would indicate that extraterrestrial intelligence has an interest in what humans are doing with nukes and nuclear energy?
Yes, you always are hearing about that. If you're making a nuclear test, UFOs show up. Particularly if it's above ground, but it's explainable in other ways. Uh, you know, you're always putting up all kinds of balloons and rockets when you'd make an above ground nuclear test. The rocket leaves a plume of uh, clouds. It's in a straight line. You can see that cloud being whipped aside when the shock wave hits it. So that's why you put up a rocket when you're firing a bomb to test it. And they have airplanes that fly over and determine, could I fly over this thing without dying, without it crashing the plane? Can I get a shot of it from the plane and so on? You do this remote controlled airplane so you're not damaging people. And that comes off as a flying saucer. So, of course, if you're doing anything military or government sponsored, you're going to have things that can be interpreted as flying saucers. And of course, they keep everything as secret as possible, and secrecy loves flying saucers because it's an explanation.
Hmm. Makes
As
sense.
far
Yeah.
as the nuclear missile site that was affected by a flying saucer, a nuclear missile site uses electricity just like your home. It has a transformer outside and wires that lead to it, and a squirrel can get in that transformer and blow it. And you know, you can have cutouts in the nuclear launch site just like anything else. It uses electricity.
Mm.
It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily have to be someone from another planet doing it.
Yeah. Squirrel seems much more uh accessible.
Yes.
It's not sexy, but it's a more accessible explanation that a squirrel chewed through some
Yeah.
wires than of of extraterrestrial intelligence traveled billions of light years to watch us launch a nuke
Right.
or test out a nuclear silo. But yeah, I just wanted to ask you because it is such a fascinating topic where there have been these reports of UFO interactions with nuclear testing and nuclear silos throughout history. But what you're saying makes sense.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Yeah. The last question I have for you is uh if if you could travel back in time to witness one historical nuclear event and you're protected from all radiation, all harm, if you could go back in time and witness one historical nuclear event, whether it's a meltdown or a blast, nuclear testing, which event would that be?
That's a good question. I would I would like to have a high speed motion picture camera protected in the SL1 containment building, and it would show me exactly what those guys did to pull the control rod.
At Chernobyl?
This was at SO1 in
Oh, SO1.
Idaho.
Hmm.
We know what happened in Chernobyl, and that would not be pretty.
Yeah. So SO1, you'd go back
Yeah,
with the
the
high
trouble with
speed camera.
SO1 is we didn't have cameras going, we didn't have any kind of recording, and everybody there died.
Hmm.
We just, found a reactor that exploded, and we think we know what happened. I think we know what happened, but I like if I could see something, it would be that,
Yeah. America's first nuclear disaster, but also the greatest mystery.
right.
Well, Jim Mahaffey, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. That was a truly captivating conversation. Your work is so interesting. I was telling you this offline yesterday, but I think what's so great about your books, Atomic Accidents and Atomic Adventures specifically, is that it's not just, you know, this is what happened and these are the facts, but you weave the chapters together in a storytelling style where it feels like you're there and it feels like you can visualize what the people were going through because ultimately that's what pulls you into the story. It's the emotions, it's the
Right.
perspective, it's feeling like you're there. And I encourage people who are listening to this conversation to go check out Jim's catalog, the books, which I will link in the description of this conversation, wherever you're listening to or watching this. But Jim, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Uh, and yeah, I'm grateful to have had this chat with you.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed talking with you. You had some very good questions, and, I enjoyed the whole thing.
Where can people follow your work? Where can they keep up with you? Do you have a newsletter, a
I
social media, anything like that, website?
I don't have anything like that. Uh, you found me, and they can find me.
All right. We'll leave it at that.